Welcome to The Power of Change, the podcast that discusses everything from clean tech to modern business and the power of change as we navigate through unprecedented times. I'm Jason Gravel, founder of Origin Energy, a company that helps people save money and lower their environmental footprint. One of the hardest things to do when starting a new business is learning to talk about what you do. Even when you're an expert in your field, you can get caught up in the technical details that don't mean anything to your target customers. Even to this day, I struggle with, and I often find myself standing in front of a prospective client talking about utility power factor or demand factor premiums just to watch their eyes glaze over, and then they start to motion for the door. It can be hard to separate yourself from the theory and express your service in terms of what it does for the customer. And what makes it even more difficult is that the theory of how you should be positioning your brand is changing. With modern branding concepts like Simon Sinek's Start With Why and Donald Miller's Building a Story brand, brands are becoming an identity. In recent years, we've even seen some big brands take on political positions. Nike featured Colin Kaepernick in a marketing campaign after the NFL kneeling controversy. And many businesses have changed their social media profile pictures to a blacked out image in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. In the past, conventional wisdom was to steer away from politics so you wouldn't run the risk of alienating certain customer segments. But now it seems like it's becoming okay to embrace an identity if it's part of your why. So today, we're going to talk to industry experts about how branding is changing and how we can help our brands connect with those who matter. Hey, Kat. So, thanks so much for agreeing to chat with me today, and welcome to the very first full episode of the Power of Change podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. It's exciting to come in and join you on this and talk marketing and stuff.
Yeah. No, exciting topics. I'll go easy on you, though.
Thank you.
To start off, how about you introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Katherine Lesperance. I go by Kat for short. And I run a marketing company here in Calgary, Alberta. And we help a lot of our clients, grow their business, whether it's growing customers, whether it's getting more investors, all those kind of things, and bringing some of the best marketing practices. So we're always looking at kind of what's on trend, what are ways that they can be sneaky of what they're doing, but as well be really smart with the budget they have and trying to grow their business and make it, a long-lasting one.
Sustainable, I guess.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
So how long have you been working in the industry?
Too long. I'm going to date myself here.
No.
You know what? I've been in marketing for probably, I'm going to say, it was over 15 years last time I counted, but I think I'm getting close to the 20-year mark.
Oh, wow. So, that's exciting.
Yeah. I mean, I started when I was 5 years old, clearly, but,
So I guess you've been around in the industry long enough to kind of see how it's changed because, on this episode of the podcast, I'm trying to understand how branding is different now compared to in the past. So how do you think marketing and branding is changing?
You know what? I think the biggest thing is that you can no longer just be a corporation or a business and just be about your product. Consumers have really started demanding a lot more out of where they're spending their dollars. It's no longer, I'm just buying this one product. I'm just getting this one service. They want to see how you're giving back to the community. They want to see how you're giving back to the environment. And it's not even just in the purchase behavior. It's even just in people wanting to apply to these companies as well. So there's that marketing aspect and that brand aspect of how are you attracting the right talent from the actions that you take. And, we've seen a lot of movements in the past year or so as well where you can no longer just be neutral, right? For the longest time, companies were kind of just like, yep, we're going to stay out of politics. We're just going to take a back seat to this. We have our internal policies that, outline our support, but, they weren't ever taking a stance. And I think now we're starting to see with social media and kind of with the power of consumers that people are demanding more and expecting a lot more for companies. So I think in that world, especially, when it comes to things like the environment, when it comes to people's rights, companies just have to really shift and now kind of draw that line in the sand of where they stand. So I think that's something we're seeing a lot more of now versus 10, 20 years ago, where it was really about like, what am I getting for the money I'm spending? And now it's kind of that mentality of how are you benefiting not only me, but the rest of the world as I choose to spend my money with you.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting because I mean I think we've even gotten to a point where some businesses and maybe starting more with bigger corporations at this point, but a lot of businesses are less afraid to take on like a social or political identity, whereas in the past they tried to be as non-controversial as possible. I mean, how do you personally feel about businesses taking on that kind of like, political position in their branding?
You know what? It's honestly it's hard, right? I think in some ways, as a person, you're kind of like, yes, I want to see these businesses taking on those stances, right? I want to see businesses standing up for more than just what they're supporting right now, right? Um, but I think as a marketer, as a professional, it's really hard to figure out how do you make sure you're supporting a side and not alienating others, or how do you make sure you get that message out there clearly? Because the hard part with social media or the hard part with PR and getting that message out there, sometimes it can be misinterpreted, right? Or, you know what? Businesses don't always get it 100% right, right? And so now with cancel culture, now with all these different things happening, it's a little bit scary in that is what your message is, the intent of your message, is that really how it's going to be received? And I think that's really the difficult part of it when trying to pick a stance. And I think that's where you see, a company might say, we stand for one thing. And then all of a sudden, everyone else says, well, that means you don't stand for X, Y, Z. Right. And it's so polarizing. And I think that's one of the hard parts where it's like, you know what? We can support both. Right. We don't have to be just in one pigeonhole. But sometimes people interpret that way and just swing it to a very different message. And I think that's kind of the difficulty of how do you manage that narrative to make sure the true intent kind of speaks through of what you want to support. And I think
Yeah, that's it.
I
Go
think
ahead.
that's where you see with energy, for instance, and for some of these like environmental campaigns, right? You see a lot of companies swinging to right now electric. And for instance, in the consumer world, it's like, hey, let's move our vehicles to electric. And so great idea. The intent is there of stop using gas, let's stop using these things. But then there's that question of, well, what about the waste on the side of electric, right? Is it truly that beneficial? Because now you're seeing other byproducts coming out of it. And now people are hanging on to those aspects and now pitting everyone against one or the other. It's not this thing of how do we balance electric with gas or oil and gas until we can find the right outcome, right? So there's kind of those differences that come up, and people are just very staunch in kind of where they're supporting. And so I think those are the difficulties of getting into that world where now you're getting so competitive with one another, and then consumers don't necessarily know where the truth lies. And I think that's one of the
Yeah.
hard parts of it and the complication
Yeah.
of it, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess, I mean, do you think social media though has something to do with like with how prevalent social media is now? Does that has something to do with how that kind of brand identity thing is changing?
Absolutely. Because I think what social media has done is it's made things more of a two-way communication versus the one way. And I think what we're going to start seeing the shift to is it's not just a two-way anymore. It's going to be much more in the hands of the consumer as how they're evaluating the brands. Whereas before it was kind of brands were evaluated based on certain criteria, based on other, marketing professionals who are evaluating brands and specialize in that field. But now it's really becoming more fragmented and kind of in the hands of a general community with perhaps some basis of what some of the principles are, but not necessarily kind of that theoretical view of what brands should be or how they should act, right? It's all about that
Yeah.
emotional side and that subjective side, which makes things very, very complicated.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
Uh you mentioned like a while ago you mentioned cancel culture and of course we're at this point where like it's easier than ever than to accidentally do something that's controversial without even realizing it. And you
hmm
gave that example about that conflict between, traditional energy and environmentalism. And so, where do you think that line is though between like showing how your business is being socially responsible versus being political?
I think that's the hard part. There is no line. So you
Yeah.
won't know it until you've crossed it. But I think that's where, it's one of those things, and that's where you still see a lot of brands who are holding off, right? They're still not going to be putting themselves out there. But you'll start seeing some of these more nimble and smaller companies who are taking those risks. And they're a bigger gamble, and sometimes they pay off and sometimes they don't. So I don't think we've found yet a point where there's a line. And I think that's where at the end of the day, it just has to come down to, for the values of the people in the business and, the employees of the business, the shareholders, it really comes down to how do you be authentic to yourself, right? I think we've seen brands where they have messed up, right?
Yeah.
They have perhaps done something and they put their foot in their mouth. But you know what? I think the bigger thing is how do you just own it, right? So if you do cross that line, it's how do you own it and show that you're going to try and correct it, right? Or how you're learning from it, how you're listening, all those kind of things. I think that's more where people want to see brands and businesses acting more authentically rather than trying to hide behind walls or trying to just be silent on things, right? So
Yeah.
it is very difficult. And I think that's where you have to kind of test some messages on market and see how they go and talk to people and not, I know I see all the time as marketers, I will see these posts about how, like don't have too many people making decisions on creative and don't do this. But you know what? You do need to test it because you can't be in your own echo chamber. You can't be in your own bubble building creative without testing it and seeing how other people act, right? I think I think that Pepsi was it Pepsi was this one of the soft drinks kind of got into a bit of an issue when they had kind of created some commercials that weren't very reflective of what was going on, right? And it's because when they built out those commercials, they weren't testing with the proper audience. They were testing it with people who were like-minded. And then when it got pushed into market, it fell flat and it actually got a lot of backlash because they didn't test it and they didn't challenge their own beliefs and look outside of that, right? So I think those are things that, again, are they still around? Absolutely, right? Can they recover from those things? Absolutely. But it's those kind of things that it really teaches you of like, you have to challenge yourself and test it. Don't necessarily spend all that money in doing one ad and getting it out there. Perhaps test it with a few different things. We've got some great tools out there, such as Facebook or, any of those pay-per-click advertising where you can test multiple messages and start seeing how they're resonating and how it's working before you go and do a large investment in something like that, right? So, and then as well in branding, it's like you can usually gather a group of people and start testing that message to your target audience and see how they're reacting.
Yeah.
So there's all those kind of things you can do to make sure that if you're not ready just to go and commit, and go somewhere perhaps like an Elon Musk and just go with what you want, right? There's ways to kind of do it in a slower and steadier way to just, try and be a little bit more cautious of what you're doing. But it's all up to your company and your approach to things. If you want to go big and give it a try, or if you want to take a little bit more of that cautious approach.
Yeah. So, but do you think, like, does being controversial matter if you're alienating people who aren't going to be your customer anyway, especially if you're in a really niche market?
You know what? It's an interesting question because I think it goes down to your values. I personally do not like polarizing people. I think that there is room to grow and kind of approach things and not have to do that polarization, because I think we've seen that happen in politics where people become so polarized and they can no longer connect with one another. From a marketing standpoint, I think it is a tactic that can work for certain companies and for people who are okay with that, right? And again, you're bang on that. Sometimes people just say, well, you know what, if these people are never going to buy from me, what do I care, right?
Yeah.
So you want to kind of build that cult following. But I think it depends on what you're trying to do. I think there's ways to educate and try and share what you're doing and building a broader audience. Because the hard part is you might have those people who are never going to buy your product, and you might have those people who are always going to be loyalist to you. But you have probably a much larger group in the middle of people who don't know where they sit, right? And so it's kind of like, are you now polarizing? So if you have 20% of people on one end who will never buy from you, 20% of people who you'll speak to because you're doing this polarizing approach. What's going to happen with that 60% in the middle?
Yeah.
Right? Are you going to swing them over to your side, or are you going to actually alienate them and push them to the other side? And now you've lost a market that you could have educated about your product. You could have built awareness around it. And now they've been turned off and there's no going back. Right? So I think that's where it's, again, is it a tactic? Yes. Has it worked? Absolutely. But I just don't know if it's necessarily what everyone is comfortable with, because sometimes you just cause too much of a reaction that might not work in your favor.
Do you think that line, though, is about framing or being subtle? And I guess the reason why, I mentioned that is because one of, the marketing stories that I found most interesting was how Subaru was struggling and they kind of turned their business around in North America back in the 90s because they realized that lesbians were 4 times more likely to buy a Subaru. So they started incorporating subtle messages into their marketing that only people from that community would pick up on. And that's actually something that happened. And
Yeah.
if it were today, I mean, I don't think that they would have tried so hard to be subtle, but what do you think specifically has changed that has allowed businesses to be more comfortable with being controversial?
I think, I love that example because I do remember hearing about that example as well and learning about that one. And I think there's, again, if they had gone a completely other route and had not gone the subtle route, I don't know if it would have been as well received.
Hmm.
Right. And again, if you put that in today's market, you know what? I don't know if it would have been well and if it would have paid off to what they were looking for. Right. Um, I think what has changed though is, I think in a lot of cases, politics to the South has influenced us.
Yeah, I would
Right?
imagine.
Like,
Yes, yes.
and I think this is where you're trying to push me to. So I was gonna, I think we have become such a divided community, and I think that's where it's influences outside of just businesses. But I think that's where you're starting to see businesses stand up, right? I think we saw a lot in the last 2 years of the tech companies starting to stand up to certain things, right? I think
Yeah,
Facebook just recently started now kind of going that. Some people are saying that they're imposing on freedom of speech. Others are saying, hate speech is not freedom of speech, and that's not what's protecting, right? So I think we're starting to see a lot of that movement change, and it's coming out of what we're seeing as politics. So I feel like that has kind of expedited a lot of what was growing with just social media and some of those voices. And it's hard to always look back because I think it's hard to say, okay, what was happening in the 90s and how do we change that? But sometimes you have these change makers who aren't necessarily going out there and being bold and brash, but they're doing it subtly, right? And it can still make the world of difference. And people need that time. I think that's the hard part, right? Is that you need time to change culture. And I think with the US, for instance, of the last 4 years, we've seen a lot of change happen in culture because of the approach that we saw with leadership there, for good or for worse, or better or for worse.
hmm,
But all of those type of things impact how we think about how we interact with businesses, about how we act as people. And then too, you have COVID on top of it, right? Um, so we had some really big movements last year, such as the Black Lives Matters movement. Again, these are issues that have been ongoing and still continue to go, but they became more apparent. I mean, that's where we saw more businesses focusing on those
yeah,
matters, right? And so I think those are things that sometimes they just come to the forefront because there's events happening, and those events are what shape us, right? I think when you look at the generations, it's really interesting because usually they talk about what events happened, right? Because that's what shifts the mindset. And that's what you have to figure out. How do you build your branding according to what people have experienced? And I think that's where, following what happened in the US, now with COVID and us coming out of kind of these lockdowns and seeing the end coming with all the vaccines on board and everything, I think that's where brands now have to pay attention to what has truly shifted in people's behaviors. right?
Yeah,
Because we're not going to come out the same and everything can go back to what it was 2 years ago. Things have
totally.
drastically changed. People's behaviors have changed. Our shopping behaviors have changed. And we're seeing this with some of our clients too, right? Of now people have been forced to shift to a digital approach, whether they liked it or not, right?
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
and I think that's going to be shifting so much of our behavior going forward, and to just how we digest news, how we access media, all those kind of things are going to be impacting, for many years to come. So I think those are things that you have to really look out for, and there's no easy answer. You just have to really test it and see how it works in your market, because especially with COVID, this has been such a fundamental shift that we haven't seen before, that
Oh,
marketers
yeah.
are having to watch the data. And now we actually have digital data, right?
Oh,
So
interesting. Yeah.
all those kind of things to start looking at a macro level of what has changed, right? Even with, if you look at home purchases, right? Before, people liked having their small homes, they were okay with it, but they didn't realize how much time they were spending at work, how much time they were spending outside. And now when you're confined to your home and you don't have a gym and you don't have a workspace, and you and your spouse are working one's out of the kitchen, one's out of a bedroom, right? All of a sudden, how you value your home and how you look at your home is very different.
Yeah. Yeah.
So now they're saying, like, a lot of cases, we're going to see a shift from condo sales to the detached homes, because
Yeah.
people
That
need that
makes a lot of
space, right?
sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where it's like, again, now you see people doing renovations and people are really concerned about having that at-home gym, having that separate den or office area, right? And those are changes that are probably going to last for a while, because people remembered, when I was stuck and I didn't have that space, I went a little crazy. It's not that they're going to go back to work and they're going to be like, cool, I'm fine. There's going to be a lot of people who are impacted with that for the rest of their lives, of saying, what's really important in my next home purchase, right?
Exactly. And I
And
guess it
those,
just also creates a shift because now people are going to be more comfortable doing that too. It's like, oh, I didn't
yes,
realize that I could, work from my home office, and now that I kind of like it, and maybe I want to keep doing that, right? Like,
exactly. Or that
yeah,
partial working from home, right? And so
yeah,
as an advertiser, I just saw, you know, looking at some data for, marketing downtown, there's sometimes limited reach because not a lot of people are downtown anymore in
yeah,
Calgary, right? And so there's all these shifts that have happened. And then too, it's kind of, what are people putting the value on, right? Um, you know, is there certain things that now speak more to them because they've been at home versus at the office?
yeah,
So all those kind of impacts and all those events, like, people have to really pay attention to it in their brand and how they're going to speak to people, to make sure that they still are relevant.
yeah. So I'm curious, like, what is your kind of core branding philosophy or approach that you recommend for your clients?
Um, so when it's branding, the thing is with branding, you have to be true to what your values are. You
Hmm.
have to really look at what are the core values of your company, because those core values are most likely not going to change. Those core values will withstand a lot of these type of events. Those core values are kind of like at the very bottom of your business, right? Like, that's what's driving you. So it's really, if you understand those true core values and then build the messaging from there, whether it's your messaging, whether it's your creative, how you present yourself, and just really ensure that everything you do is related to those core values. Because I think the hard part is when people try to stray or try to be a bandwagon jumper and jump on something, because it's in trend, because it's coming up. If you don't, if you don't exude those actions even before that trend comes up, people aren't going to believe it, right?
Yeah,
People are going to see through that, and it's not hard to see through those things. It's really easy to do a quick look at, like, what kind of things have you posted on, what kind of, um, what's on your reputation for Glassdoor and how you treat employees, right? All those things will come through if you're not living those values. And so I think that's where, as a brand, you have to really understand that. And I know one great tech company here. They were part of a discussion when we were looking at talking about, women equality, right? And how do we start bringing equality in? And one of the things that they were looking at is they were looking at the pay gap between women and men for the same roles.
hmm,
And one of the things they were saying was that they they don't know if they have an unconscious bias, right? And they don't want to be the ones contributing to the issue. But what ends up happening is a lot of times women don't ask for an increase to their offer. They'll usually get a job offer and they'll take it at face value.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas men will often, push on that initial offer and often get a higher paying salary. Again, the same job, same qualifications, but because the men asked, they're now creating a pay gap, right?
Yeah.
And again, there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing there's nothing malicious about it. But this company was like, we don't want to be the ones contributing to it. So how do we look at building a policy that doesn't allow for this in a way, right? Like if you're paying based on qualifications, it should be based on qualifications. It should not be on the fact whether somebody asked or didn't ask, right? And that's causing now an issue with pay gaps between genders. So there's things like that, I think, that as we challenge, and again, this is them living through who they are as a business. This wasn't an auditor coming and flagging the issue to them.
Yeah.
This is them doing it on their own accord because they're like, you know what, we value these things. And so we're going to put on ourselves to be better and to do better. Right? So I think those are the kind of things as a brand is like, you've really just got to follow what you truly value. Right?
Yeah,
So,
totally. Yeah, well, and it's awesome though that businesses are kind of look at these issues and understand how to deal with them because I mean that's where it starts.
exactly. And we have to
Yeah,
take that introspect, right? And it's often hard to do that to yourself. Because you think you are always trying to do the best, right? But it's like we have to challenge ourselves to do those things and really make sure we are living those values through and through.
yeah. So do you have a website or social media you'd like to mention?
Oh, sure. Yeah, we have a website. It's just sensiblemarketer.ca that if anyone wants to come visit us, they can and ask for any help or any questions that they need. We're not as active on social media. I think, we're going to have to build that up yet for now, but they can stay tuned for updates and just any marketing trends or blogs or resources that we put up on our site to help them grow their business.
Great. Well, thanks so much for chatting with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you too, Jason. Bye.
Hey, Jim. How's it going? Thanks so much for coming and chatting with me today. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks, Jason. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. This is exciting. I'm really interested in this topic and some of the work that you've been doing. So I'd love to chat more about it. So I guess I'll just like jump right into it. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell me about what you do?
Well, I'm Jim Jensen, and I'm with Strategic Coaching Canada. And so what I do is provide businesses with business coaching and primarily small to medium-sized businesses. And as well, I also provide strategic services for those same businesses.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, for sure. And then I guess from what I understand, there's kind of a component of branding to that as well.
Yes, yeah, definitely in terms of for my business, I have a philosophy on even so far as the name of the business to the types of messaging that you use that should always be about what you do to help solve your customer's problem. So
Yeah.
So I've attempted to do that even with the name of the business.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah, so in this episode of the podcast, I'm really trying to explore the idea about how branding is changing. And I think that maybe in the past, branding was more about what you can offer. But it seems now that businesses more and more are taking on kind of a social identity. I mean, what is that underlying philosophy for you? And what do you think makes that, the most effective?
Well, my philosophy has always been, and this is, I've been doing this now over 20 years. And
Yeah.
one thing that has not changed is that people lose interest very quickly if the person doing the talking is talking all about themselves. And
Yeah.
and that seems to be has been a trend for a long time. Whether it's verbally or in any types of documentation that businesses offer to clients or potential clients, to websites. There's been this trend that businesses want to believe that they need to talk about themselves and build themselves up, and in actual fact, you're losing your audience's attention and interest by doing that, because we have this internal need to tell our own story. So,
Yeah.
so the whole idea behind the philosophy that with this company that I've now become a certified business coach with StoryBrand is to invite your audience, which is hopefully a potential customer or an existing customer, into a story, and that story is about them, about the client.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And it's weird too, because I realize now after conversing with you and now that I've read the book as well, because you encouraged me to do so, I realize I was guilty of that as well. I mean, I'm a relatively new business owner. I've been running, Origin for over about 3 years now. And I realized all along I'd been doing that myself, was telling my own story. And I think I was realizing that, it's not really landing with people, but I guess that makes sense because it isn't about you, right? And then I think now that I've read this book, I think it's pretty amazing. And I think it's probably a must read for, many business owners because it really helps you set up that strategy about how to build out your brand.
Yes.
And it's weird too, because since I come from a kind of like a counseling and psychology background, I'm really interested in social systems and creating a culture in your company. So I guess one of the things that really stood out to me was something called the narrative void. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how it can help your company clarify its message?
Well, the narrative void, and there's many different terms, but essentially the narrative void is one way to put it. Is this is a common cultural issue that is plagued, particularly in larger companies, and that's that there's a division between departments within a large company, which includes their messaging. Their messaging isn't consistent, and so the narrative void is that the messaging isn't consistent from department to department within larger companies, and that is usually caused because large companies typically departments have not worked well together for various reasons, but it's usually cultural reasons, and that includes the messaging. So when it comes to customers of that company, if they are talking, let's say, to a sales department on one day and then in the engineering department on another day, they may find that the message that they're getting is different, and that can create confusion and possible conflict and frustration for customers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess I'm curious though, is that a marketing issue or is that a leadership issue or is it a combination of both?
Well,
Because I can kind of see how, yeah, it could go either way.
well, I mean, if you're asking me, everything comes down to leadership.
Yeah.
So if the leaders are not conveying a common message, then there's a disconnect amongst leadership of a company. So I think that is where the real problem generally will lie. Marketing can always fall from there, but to answer your question, I believe that's a leadership.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess oftentimes I guess, we think about branding as an external thing, and then when you're talking about the narrative void, you're looking at it as an internal thing. So and I guess that means in a sense that when you're trying to develop your story, you have to look at it from both angles. It's not just about what you're putting out to your people or to your clients or your prospective clients or your target market. It's also how you're really clarifying that message internally. And that's really fascinating because I think is it true that you would say that like that is a problem in most businesses that they're not commuting that story internally?
Well, let's just say in many businesses, I would say that in most businesses there probably is room for improvement, for sure. But I would definitely say many businesses have a disconnect in their messaging, and it usually comes down to the teams aren't um, aren't on aren't operating on a common message, which is a common goal for the team or goals. And so this is where messaging, in my mind, is huge for companies. Is to get people onto one common, consistent message, so that teams internally understand what their purpose is within the team, and ultimately what the goal is that they're trying to achieve for success.
Yeah. Okay. So how does like mission and vision fit into that though? I mean, do you think it's enough all in its own?
Well, vision, I think they're two different things. I think in terms of mission, I believe in terms of teams for team members within a company, I would stick to mission, and the idea is that you have one common mission amongst the entire company, and get get teams onto a mission. And so, a very simple way to look at this is, let's say a company does have a mission statement, but if no one can recite it, if no one has it memorized, then
Yeah.
then that company and those individuals are not on a mission. So, in order to be on to be on a mission and to have an effective mission statement, it's something that needs to be memorized and repeated, and should be the focal point of every team meeting in every organization.
Yeah, totally. I guess a big challenge though is even if you're good at articulating, what you want, what your mission is as a leader, I mean, how do you deal with complacency? I mean, at least when you get to a certain point with organizations, a certain stage of growth, you have so many people, and how do you make sure that everybody really is in line with that, though? Like, because like at a certain point, you can't really be keeping tabs on everyone individually.
No, and in fact, I think it's important that you give your team members a feeling of independence, that they are ultimately, people have a need to be a part of a success story and to be part of a successful team. And there's been many studies on this. And yes, it's important that people are remunerated correctly.
Hmm.
But the fact is that what gets people excited to get out of bed, to go to work, and leave their work at the end of the day to be excited about the next day is that they're a part of a success story. And so that means building a mission statement, which includes, which is part of building a whole set of guiding principles for a
Yeah.
company, and to be constantly reinforcing those guiding principles amongst the team through team meetings and through other forms of communication internally, and and that people understand what their role is in terms of fulfilling that mission.
That's a really powerful statement, I think, being a part of a success story. And I think that really kind of coalesced it in my mind. It was like, okay, now I think I get it, right? Whereas, like, I feel like I understand the concept of creating employment culture or, setting a vision, but I'm not sure that I necessarily really understood how to kind of create that. And I think that really helps it helped me frame it in my mind. Is like, yeah, because if people, really buy into where you're going and believe in it, they're gonna want to see it, want to make sure it's successful. So that's really interesting. But it's funny because on the flip side, I do have to come clean about something. And ironically, like really ironically, I've always been a natural skeptic of employment culture. And that is ironic because I'm so fascinated by it and I think it's so important. But I find what happens is that culture within a profession or an industry can often resist kind of creativity and innovation. Um, so, I mean, oftentimes you end up with a situation where many of the disruptive innovations that come to an industry are developed by outsiders. So there seems to be this kind of a tension between institutional conformity and innovation, especially when you get to businesses that are a lot bigger. And so
Yeah.
another thing that really stood out to me in the story brand book is about auditing the existing thoughtmosphere. And to me, I guess the way I interpret that is that it's maintaining a culture that questions the culture to foster innovation. I mean, how do you nurture that? How can you keep that up?
Well, what's important is that, getting back to leadership again, is that leaders need to understand that most of the great ideas that are available to a company's success are amongst the everyday line employees and team members of companies. It's quite often not the leaders that have the great ideas, and yet
Yeah.
it's the leaders that stifle that. I mean, this goes back to you know trends from years and decades ago where leaders are hired and promoted for the wrong reasons, and a lot of big companies will tend to promote from within people that are great at doing a technical skill and have done great things for the company, so they promote them into a leadership position, and that person is now not doing what they were great at,
Yeah.
aren't perhaps don't have the training or perhaps even the desire to be in that position, and are not given the tools to be successful as a leader within the organization.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can definitely see how that could be true. Um, yeah, no, it definitely seems to be a challenging thing, right? Like, yeah, the people are good at what they're doing, so they're promoted, but it doesn't necessarily, yeah, mean that they're good at that next stage and where they're at in that leadership position, for sure. Um, I guess, with this whole idea of creating a story and creating, you know, kind of a brand that you want to help, to position to your clients and internally, and it seems like some bigger companies may be doing this already, and it sort of kind of would put me onto the idea of talking about this stuff. So we seem to be moving into an area where big established brands are taking on more political or social positions. Like, for example, BlackRock, which is one of the world's biggest money managers, is divesting from environmentally dirty investments and pushing towards integrating sustainability into their investment philosophy. And I'm wondering, like, is this like what role does branding play in corporate responsibility, or does it even play a role, or is it just a marketing thing?
Well, I think certainly branding can help promote the social responsibility of a corporation. Um, I don't think branding in itself will sustain long term the social responsibility of a company. The company has to walk the talk, and but if if it's to a to a company's best interest to brand themselves uh, towards a social cause, then I mean it's a great approach. You are definitely segmenting yourself to a certain part of a market, and perhaps eliminating another part of a market that may not agree with that social position. But um, it can be to a company's advantage. I don't think the branding, to answer your question, Jason, I don't think the brand or the branding or the messaging of a company in itself is the social position. They still have to walk the talk. They still have to do the things that are part of the message that they're trying to get across. If it's only just talk, then they're actually going to lose credibility by going that way.
Yeah, for sure. I would imagine so. But I guess it's weird though, because when I think about, it was really surprising to me when I heard about the situation where Nike use Colin Kaepernick in their marketing material, which I mean I think is amazing. But it was just surprising to me that such a big corporation took such a strong political position. And I mean, do you think though that when they do that, that is the story that they're trying to create?
Well, Nike isn't has already established their brand and their name and have for decades.
Yeah.
It goes back to the '60s, and so they've already established themselves. I don't think in that example that they cut off a lot of their market by going that route with Colin Kaepernick. I think what they were doing was trying to revitalize a market that they were trying to penetrate and perhaps motivate a little bit more than they otherwise were prior to the Colin Kaepernick message. But
Yeah.
I don't think in that example they lost much market for those that may not agree with the social position of Colin Kaepernick.
Yeah, that's probably true for sure. It's still interesting though. I thought, I mean, I guess it was the first time that I had noticed that, a company had took such a strong political position. But yeah, no, it's probably true that I guess like by and large they're trying to appeal to a demographic that would be supporting that position. It's still kind of interesting though how that's changing because it seems like it wasn't that long ago that politics and marketing or business is very much taboo. Is that something that you're seeing with businesses at all with that you're working with?
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think this is part of a larger picture that we've become more polarized, more divisive
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, just in the last 5 years. And social media has been a part of that, and certainly the political leaders that we've had both in Canada and the U.S. Have been a part of that, and the political parties have been a part of that.
Yeah. Wow, this is such a fascinating topic. I could probably keep going on this forever. Uh, yeah, thanks so much for chatting with me. I really appreciate it. Do you have a website or social media or anything like that you would like to shout out?
Yeah, my website is stratcoaching.com, and certainly I welcome anyone listening to go to that. And in particular, there's right on the homepage, there's a button there called Take the Business MRI, which for anyone in business will give you a good snapshot by going through for about 10 minutes a series of questions to have a look at 9 different areas of your business to determine areas of strength and areas that could use some attention. It will come up with a result, and I certainly would welcome you to have a look at that. And if you want to chat about it, to the left of that button is a button called Schedule a Conversation. So I would welcome anyone that would like to have a chat.
Yeah, cool. No, thanks so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for the
All right.
opportunity, and certainly all the best to everyone listening today.
What is marketing and branding to me? My name is Fred, a team member of Origin Energy, and after listening to these two experts in the field, Kat and Jim gave me loads of insight that never really occurred to me. As a business development manager, marketing and branding is an integral part of the role, regardless of the job description. Apparently, understanding our markets, values, and identity is just the tip of the iceberg. And when given the opportunity and platform to reflect on the topic, my thoughts easily pull me in opposite directions. Hear me out. On one hand, and really without much effort, I'm certain most of us can recollect on how marketing and branding has bombarded our senses, even as early as our first memory. Think about it. Everything from what cereal we ate at breakfast, to what gadgets to ask for the holidays, to what concerts or events to attend on the weekend. It's everywhere. Our phones, TVs, websites, billboards, posters, benches, sometimes the sky, and it's everything. Beverages, candy, cars, entertainment, food, vacations, and even people. The Kardashians are living, breathing advertisements. It's a given consistency and method used to perpetuate our product-driven economy. And on the other hand, and definitely with much more effort, we each use marketing and branding in our daily lives without even realizing it. When was the last time you had a job interview? Or maybe the last time you set up a birthday party and invited guests? Maybe you're trying to get rid of an old lawnmower on Kijiji. All of it and then some is an act of promoting and selling yourself, a party, or a lawnmower. When you think about it like that, it is a skill that most of us have been honing for our entire lives. I remember the mean streets of the playground when Pokemon cards first came on the scene. As naive as we were, some kids just knew how to market their cards better than others. We learned quickly what was authentic or not, who was trustworthy, and who we should ultimately trade with. Word travels quick on the playground. And by the way, Pokemon cards have valued incredibly over time. Some bids for boxes of cards easily surpass $150,000 US. I'm really wishing I kept mine now. As someone who is subjected to and uses marketing and branding on a daily basis, both in my personal and professional life, understanding, practicing, and improving the skill has been a game of tug-of-war, if not a byproduct of larger goals. Between conscious studying and nuanced subjugation, I've become more aware of the broader and intrinsic effects of marketing and branding in my life. I perform and manage a local Calgary band. We play original funk, soul, jazz, and R&B music. I don't know if you remember what school or group projects were like. Well, it's that, but with professional musicians and money. It might as well be managing 7 other aloof cats. From understanding demographics, markets, values, brands, release strategies, PR, narratives, and partnerships, it has been the biggest schooling for me. Real-life experience is invaluable. This is what marketing and branding is to me. On the surface, marketing is a tool and method used to sell and promote a product or service, whereas branding is the means of identification through name, symbols, and design. I'm aware of the effects and its uses, dull and aware of the intent, sharp and focused as my own weapon. My biggest takeaway from my lifelong experience with the topic is this: authenticity, transparency, and honesty are what make marketing and branding effective. To parrot the interviewees, consumers have become smarter and much more aware of what marketing and branding is in this modern, connected era. Think about yourself and your own spending habits. We have the ability to research, familiarize, and preemptively make decisions about products and services before we even see an ad, let alone a salesperson. If there's any kind of false claims, negative reviews, or any poor information regarding the product, service, or company, bet your ass that the modern consumer will pick this up and have it as ammo before even talking to you. Well, with that being said, we live and breathe marketing and branding, whether we know it or not. Here's my suggestion. Live as authentically and honestly as you can. Because in today's connected world, detective work is at the tips of the fingers. My name is Fred with Origin Energy, and thank you for listening.
To learn more about how you can save money and lower your environmental footprint, visit originenergy.ca. Remember, you can always leave us an audio message by visiting anchor.fm/originpoc. We'll definitely include interesting messages in future episodes. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for helping us power brighter communities.